Welcome to the On the Blue Line podcast with Wayne Mulder, and I am your host. Yeah, you got this figured out. I am your host, Wayne Mulder. This week, 3 things that I would do if I was a new law enforcement officer today. The On the Blue Line podcast starts now. If you break the law, if you decide to do this, we're going to hold you responsible.
You are the only good thing in someone's worst day. That is a privilege for a police officer.
At the very least, you could honor the sacrifices of police officers and their families.
We have the ability to save the Republic. So welcome back. It is Thursday, October 10th. If you are watching this, I of course had to record it a few days before Thursday, October 10th. And of course, there's another storm bearing down on us here in Florida, but more on that in a moment. If you enjoying this content, if you want more of the content that is only for subscribers, be sure to check out our Patreon page at the links below. I try to weekly put some content in there for those who subscribe to the channel. So be sure to check that out. And then be sure to follow us on YouTube and Rumble. Every one of these is done in video. And actually, our podcast from 2 weeks ago, where I talked about 6 lies that I was told when I started out in the law enforcement career, was actually our most watched video to date. So we actually got quite a bit of traction on that one on both YouTube and on Rumble. So I put out a post this week on X because it had been a couple weeks since I'd been on social media. And of course, there was no podcast last Thursday. And that was because it's been kind of a crazy 3 weeks. So roughly 2.5 weeks ago, we were scheduled to be on vacation in Key West, which we were. And it was absolutely beautiful. We took what they call the Key West Express out of Fort Myers, which is essentially a boat that you can take down. And 3 hours later, you arrive at the docks in Key West. And then we came back the same way, and it was a few days before Helene actually came up through the Gulf of Mexico, so it was absolutely gorgeous. In fact, the Gulf of Mexico, the Straits, the Atlantic Ocean down around Key West, it was like glass. In fact, I'll put some of these images up here on the screen. It was just absolutely incredible. Then I come back up to Central Florida just in time for Helene to hit and saw that same ocean do such destruction to people's houses. Really, there is a major road that goes along the west coast of Florida, US 19. It goes from pretty much way up in the north side near Perry and goes all the way down along the coast. And anyone who was west of that coast whose house was not on stilts was pretty much destroyed. You had 3 to 4 foot of floodwater come into your home. And if you were up on stilts, you still had a lot of destruction to the bottom floor. So just absolutely horrible what we saw. And then last week, I had been pre-scheduled before all of this to teach at a local law enforcement academy, a class 2 law enforcement officers. So it's kind of like a continuing education class on the exciting subject of report writing. Oh, I know. It was extremely exciting. You missed English grammar rules. I mean, it's just the fun. Yeah, anyway. But it actually went really well, and I got to work with a lot of young officers. There were actually some that have been officers a long time in there as well, but a lot of young officers, and it was a good time, and we were able to try to make it fun and got some positive feedback. So that was a blast. And then when I'm getting ready to record this, we are now looking at the news articles of tropical storm Milton, possibly or soon to be Hurricane Milton, bearing down on the west coast of Florida, which is bad. There's just no other way to say it. Whether it affects us directly or our neighbors to the south or our neighbors to the north, it's going to affect somebody adversely if it continues anywhere near the track that it's on. And some of those people who will be affected adversely will be people who are just now recovering from the flooding. One thing to keep in mind is not only does it destroy everything in the home, but let's say you were up on stilts. Well, one of the other problems you're going to have is that salt water got in there, so the counties are not going to, and the electric companies are not going to let you turn any electric on for obvious safety reasons until inspectors come out. You get contractors out there, which of course everybody needs one, so none are available. So it could be weeks, months longer that some people, even even if they have livable space in their home, may be without electricity in one of the hottest, humid, most uncomfortable states I've ever lived in. That part, I miss Indiana. But anyway, our thoughts and our prayers go out to all of them and to everyone who's affected. And honestly, if the storm maintains this track, it's going to affect my schedule again, which will affect this podcast, and on the ripple effect goes. So our thoughts and prayers are with those who are recovering. There's a lot of good organizations out there on the front lines. And as I said on social media, I believe in our Facebook group, the On the Blue Line community. If you're not in there, be sure to join. But the On the Blue Line community Facebook group, as I said to them, we will be monitoring this. I'll continue to have conversations with some of the law enforcement officers I personally know who were affected. And if there is anything that we can do as a community and as the On the Blue Line, we certainly will. And I will certainly pass that on to you. So I sat down and like I said, with the popularity of that last episode of 6 Lies that I was told when I was coming into law enforcement, I thought, well, maybe we need to follow that up with 3 things that I would do as a new officer today. The reality is they are 3 things that I actually did. The second one, maybe not as well as I could have, but there are 3 things that I did, and it actually worked out pretty well for me. I was very fortunate. Around the 5-year mark, I was actually promoted to sergeant, and around the 10-year mark, I was promoted to lieutenant. So very, very fortunate in that regard. Now, you may be listening to this, and the first thought that you have, the first thing that you think is, well, I don't really want to be, I don't really want to be a supervisor. I don't want to be a sergeant. I don't want to be a lieutenant. I love being a detective, and I fully understand that, and that's great. These rules, these principles, these ideas are just as applicable to you as they are to somebody who is seeking to move up into some sort of rank. And honestly, depending on where you're at in life and what you have, I probably would have done things a little differently and stayed in CID much longer because I just loved it. If I was younger when I came to this career, if I was in a different position with my goals outside of law enforcement, so a lot of ifs there, right? So just because you're like, well, I'd rather be a detective for 10 years, 15 years, and then maybe think about being a sergeant towards the end of my career, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And that's not the point of any of this. But for somebody who comes in this career and they're wanting to move up, they're wanting to get some form of supervisor experience early on in their career, then this is a few things that actually help me get there a little bit faster. So the first thing, and it's funny, I did some research and I even checked out what our AI overlord said about it when I ran the question to him, and it came back with the same idea, which was education. Now, I know when you hear education, especially for most cops, there's going to be a little eye roll. You're going to be like, really? I hear this over and over again. What are you talking about, education? Do you mean I got to go back to college? Do you mean well, maybe. Maybe that is what I mean, depending on your situation. But honestly, we have more and more people, especially at the agency that I'm with, that has really focused strongly on the importance of college education, that many of the young officers coming into the career already have their college education. So that's clearly not what I'm talking about in those situations. So let me break this down, right? So yes, there is something to getting your college education. It can be a formal education. When I first came into law enforcement, obviously there are more and more agencies, including the one I was with, were starting to have minimum standards as far as the amount of education you had, formal education, in order to move on to some sort of supervisory position. And I saw the proverbial handwriting on the wall, if you would, and said, well, this is what I need to do. As I've been very open about, and as I've discussed on this podcast numerous times, prior to this, I had ran a landscape company. And when I ran my landscape company, I wasn't going to spend the money or the time and the resources to try to go get a college education because it wasn't necessary for what I was doing. In fact, if anything, I would have looked towards more like a design certificate, something that would have helped with what I was currently doing at that time. However, in law enforcement, there is a desire to have that 4-year degree, especially for like the position of sergeant, lieutenant, and they would like that master's degree when you get above that. So one of the things I did is I took advantage. The agency would actually pay for it. So I took advantage of it and I went to school and I got that degree. But formal education is not the only thing that I'm referring to. There is also, as you all know, advanced specialized trainings. Just this week, I was looking at somebody's yearly review, and on their yearly review, it stated that they hadn't tried to take any classes, any specialized classes in 12 months. So there's a lot of factors, right? So in no way am I casting judgment. In no way am I being disparaging towards this one person. I don't know their story, their situation specifically. I do have questions and I will be asking those questions, but I don't specifically know for the purpose of this what their scenario is. But here's what I could tell you from my story, right? So when I started, I was very fortunate to be on a squad that prioritized these classes. It was also a time that there were certain things that would benefit them, right? So speed measurement, of course, some people, some agencies, some states, that's already part of the curriculum when you're coming right out of the academy, but that's not true around here. So I actually went back and got speed measurement under my belt and some of those intro level law enforcement classes, if you would. But one of the ones that I really like, for instance, breath test operator. I probably wouldn't have gone to that, except at the time I was working there were only machines in certain parts of the county, and where I was working at was right near where one of those machines was. So my sergeant came to me and said, hey, I would like you to go to this class, get certified, and then that way, when those late inevitable drunk driving arrests happen in the early morning hours, you'll be nice and close and be able to run over there and help out with the breath test operation. So that, for instance, was one thing where, okay, that made sense. And the same was true when I would later, so I did a lot of other classes. In fact, for those first few years, I went to class after class after class to get the basic law enforcement ones done. Then when I went into CID, specifically economic crimes, I started getting a lot of financial based investigation classes. And I want to say I went to like 4 or so in like a 1.5 year period, and started working on getting certificates in that. And then when I moved into more of a crimes against persons, then I started going to classes for that. The point is that by the time I got ready to sit down for my first promotional exam, I had already had all these. First of all, I'd maxed out my incentive pay, which is something through the state where you get a little stipend, a little bit of extra money for having gotten that education. So that's a plus that will serve you over your career. But then I also had all of these hours that would help me when I sat down to actually go to the promotional exam. So I had the advanced specialized classes, as well as by then had gotten my college degree. And it helped put me in a position that I was ready, especially when we're talking about all these points and so forth that will help you when you sit down to take a promotional exam. The other thing is by constantly being a student, right? When I say the word education, I'm not talking necessarily formal. I'm not even necessarily talking these advanced specialized classes. Sometimes it's just being a student, right? Things are always changing. There's always new legislative updates. There's a changing legal landscape, what you can do, what you can't do. So it should be natural to you. And one of the things right out the gate, if you're a brand new officer, I was fortunate this week. I actually had one of the fans of this podcast reach out to me, and we were able to go back and forth a little bit. And again, I've mentioned it to everybody. If you follow this podcast, be sure to follow us on Instagram at On the Blue Line Podcast, or at On the Blue Line and the number 1 on Twitter. And if you've got a question, if there's something that I can help you with, be sure to just send me a message, or you can always email me at wayne@ontheblueline.com. But this person reached out and they had some specific questions. In fact, some of those questions will be part of a Q&A that I'm going to be doing next week. But they were like, well, when I first come to this career, what are some things I can expect? Well, when I answer that question, this focusing on your educational journal. So for a journey, if you are, first of all, your formal education, then your advanced specialized training, and then thirdly, just being a student, whether it's familiarizing yourself with the law and with things that are changing in this ever-changing career. And then there's also the side of personal growth and just building resilience, right? There is, what is that? I believe it's attributed to the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, where he said that no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river and he is not the same man. Well, it's talking about the inevitability of change and how things are always changing. But the reality is you shouldn't ever be the same man or woman. You should always be changing, always developing, always evolving. I think about it all the time. I'm like, well, maybe a year ago I wouldn't have done it this way, or I think differently, or man, I seem to have changed. And then I stop and I'm like, well, that's a good thing. I shouldn't be the same person that I was even a week ago. I want to be constantly evolving, constantly striving, constantly getting better. So now we've talked about formal, we've talked about advanced specialized, we've talked about professional development, but then there's also the whole self-education side. Now, part of it may be listening to podcasts like this one. If so, thank you. But there's other podcasts out there. There's other books out there. I have an Audible subscription. I am constantly listening to books. Now, honestly, I don't listen to a lot of law enforcement books, which is kind of this weird thing that has been an underlying since I started this podcast in 2019. Because on one hand, I've started a podcast for law enforcement officers while simultaneously my focus is more business and business development, personal development. So I spend a lot more time and energy studying in that space than I do in this space, which is kind of the irony of all of this. But whatever it is for you, maybe it's YouTube videos, maybe it's podcasts. And I'm not talking like dumb cat videos, right? Not that there's anything wrong with dumb cat videos. What I am saying, though, is for the first time, the amount of resources that we have at our fingertips, the amount of things that you can do without having to actually pay to go to school is unbelievable. So the only thing holding you up is you. And I know we've all had these persnickety bosses, these, corporals have been here forever, sergeants have been here forever. Wow, you don't need to waste your time doing that. We're too busy, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. There has to be some balance, and that balance will come into my next 2 points. But for point number one, prioritizing self-education can be just a huge boost to not only what you're doing now, but all those things that you say you want to do in the future. So the second thing is having what I'm calling having a family plan. Now, maybe the first thing you say is, well, I'm single. Okay. Still applicable. I'm still talking the same thing because you still most likely have a family. And if you don't have a family, then you would have a group of friends and those around you who kind of operate as a family unit. So this really applies to everybody, right? But for me, when I came into law enforcement, I had a family. So having a family plan and being intentional. One of the things is, again, talking that I kind of love that business environment. I'm trying to start businesses. This is what I enjoy. And I've had a thought lately that it's very easy, right? So when you have a business, you try to structure a team, you have regular meetings, you have regular updates, you kind of inspect what you expect, all these little slogans and so forth for running a business. And yet we don't take these principles of family meetings and goals and family mission, and we don't take that seriously, and we don't adopt it to our actual family and friends. Now, I'm not saying that you come at them and say, well, I'm the boss around here. You got it. Yeah, really. That darn well, if you've listened to this show if you listened to it for 20 minutes, welcome. It's the first show you've listened to. But if you've listened to previous episodes, you know better than that, right? And so here's the thing, right? We can take some of these principles and have regular meetings. Have you had a spouse meeting? Do you and your wife or your husband meet on a regular basis? Do you kind of plan out the year? Do you plan out your vacations and say, okay, here's what we're going to focus on between here and there, and then we're going to do that? Do you have regular budget meetings, just like you would in a business environment? Are you both on the same page? Do you ever come to each other and say, hey, how is it going? What is your feedback? Can you evaluate where I'm at? See, when I say have a family plan, we first have to set boundaries, right? Boundaries between work and home. And it is very difficult in this industry sometimes to create those boundaries. I fully understand that. In fact, when things such as these dang tropical storms and hurricanes keep bearing down, it gets even harder because every plan you have goes out the window. But that doesn't mean that we don't try to prioritize it, and it doesn't mean that we don't have clear boundaries when things aren't all going to heck, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, when you're at home, be at home. Now, sometimes you are on call, so you have to plan around that, right? But then all the more reason for when you're not on call that you put that phone away. You turn those notifications off. You focus on what you're doing at that time and focus on your family. And I know I can be the pot calling the kettle black on this. I definitely struggle with this from time to time. But through the years, I've seen how important it is. And so the same thing with no work talk during family time. Now, When you're talking your family, that's a great rule. When you're talking, you have friends and people you hang out with over and they're fellow cops, you're going to have shop talk. There's just no way around it. So then it's more about being intentional and trying to limit it, right? Don't let it become a bitch session. Don't let it be a bunch of whining and cynicism. You're going to talk shop. That's just part of it. But control where that goes. But then that's why it's also important to have friends who are from other careers, who do things outside of the law enforcement career. The same is true for communication, right? Be willing to communicate openly. And that comes down to the things I was saying in the beginning about being intentional in how we schedule our time. Creating family traditions. So I've talked about it before. Anyone who's in the law enforcement career can tell you, you are probably not going to celebrate holidays on the holidays. So sit down with your family, have these conversations. Usually you're bidding at least 6 months in advance, sometimes a year in advance for your schedule. So I know whether or not I'm working Christmas right now. I know whether or not I'm working Thanksgiving. I know whether or not I'm working Valentine's Day, all the above. So I can sit down and say, all right, well, what day do we want to celebrate this on? Or as you progress in your career, you might be able to get it off. But one of the problems of constantly moving up, if you do get promoted, repeated several times in a row, then while that's happening, you're always back on the bottom of the list anyway. So it's one of those things where you just got to be intentional about it. Hey, let's celebrate it on this day. And with younger kids, it's even easier because they don't really know which day is December 24th and which day is December 25th and which day is December 31st. None of it really catches them when they're real young. And so you can use that to your advantage, but the same is true as they get older. In fact, the way we do kind of one of these 3 days on, 2 days off, 3 days off, anyway. 1 week you only work Wednesday, Thursday. The next week you work every day but Wednesday, Thursday. So for me on Thanksgiving, I would rather that always be my short week and I work actual Thanksgiving Day so that I can have the 3-day weekend and we celebrate Thanksgiving on Friday. It works for our family. I don't know what will work for you, but these are the conversations. And the individual who reached out to me this week, he was like, well, what if we're what if we're starting a family? All the more reason to have these conversations before you even get married. You're going to be in this career for 20 years, possibly 25, possibly 30 years. Have these conversations early and have them often. That way you're on the same page. The things that I'm suggesting are going to help to minimize that stress for your family. Because by having that intentionality, having that scheduling, having these pre-planned meetings, it's going to make it so much easier. So there's many more things I could mention on this, but I'm going to leave the family one right there. I want to give you the third one for this week, which is pick good mentors. We've heard the quote, show me your friends today and I'll show you who you will be tomorrow. It's so true. I've also said and have said for years, you are the sum total of the 5 people that you spend the most time around. That is the fact, is the people that you decide to spend your time around are going to influence you. It's going to kind of change how you think, what you do, why you do what you do. When we're talking about the family and stuff, that's why it's so important to have friends who have other families, who have, if you are trying to start a family and you've come into the law enforcement career, but all your friends are single and partying every night, what do you think that added stress is going to be on your family, right? Because you're going to be torn between your friends that are calling you every night. Hey, you want to still go hang out? Hey, you want to go do this? While you're trying to raise a family, which is your priority. The same is true when it comes to mentorship. Having people, I would have older friends, and I've been very fortunate to have some really good sergeants, some really good lieutenants, some really good people who in my career I could reach out to, I could follow, I could emulate, and I could learn from, and it helped me at the career level. That same principle is just as important if you don't work in law enforcement and in your personal life. Have those people around you. Like I said, my goal is to start a business. So I've been trying to surround myself with the people who do what I want to do. The people who are very successful at podcasting, very successful at coaching, very successful at getting their message out there, at being public speakers, at all these things, right? Find those people, make them your team, the people, your board of directors, your board of influencers. Those are the people who are going to mentor you and help you get to the next level. Have them both in the law enforcement career and have them outside the law enforcement career. So I hope you enjoyed this. Law enforcement is not like any other career. And so intentionality is the key. But the truth is all of the three things I just went over are just as effective for you, no matter what career you work in or where you are in your life. Maybe you're like, well, I'm retired. I'm not worried about education. I'm not worried. Well, that is the wrong perspective. I don't care if you've been retired for 10 years. We are never, ever at a point that we shouldn't be moving into some sort of self-education. We shouldn't be expanding our skill set. Maybe you're at a point in life that it's hobbies that you're growing, right? But it is just as applicable for you as it is the 40-year-old family guy who's trying to build a business. And the same is true with prioritizing family time, having those regular conversations, even if you're both retired. It may be even all the more important, so you don't kind of fall into a siloed relationship at the time that you should be working together the most. The other thing is, and this is a sad truth for those of you just coming into this career, is if you spend the next 30 years being completely away from your family, and I don't mean physically, I mean mentally, emotionally, like you don't do what I'm suggesting, and you decide that for the next 30 years, you're just going to do your thing, and then at the end, you're going to retire, and then we will work on the relationship, I can guarantee you will not have a relationship to work on. I've seen it over and over and over and over again, because that intentionality now, while you're going through what you're going through, while you're building your career, while you're building your family, you do that now. You put the work in now, and when you get to retirement, you're going to benefit from it. And the same is true with all three of these points, and even on the mentorship. And maybe if I am talking to somebody older, I know I have listeners of the show who've been retired for years, maybe you're the mentor. Maybe you're at the point in your career, in your life, that it's time for you to be the sage, to come back and to impart that wisdom to the younger generation, to maybe go meet up with them. And I'm not saying at the FOP and having beers, even though there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not the environment I'm talking about. Let's try the coffee shop. Let's try maybe even at the academy or at these other things that you can say, hey, I am here to help you become who you want to be and to do well, not just in this career. Because here's the thing, you could be the best cop, the cop's cop, the very best cop that's ever existed. And if you fail at the stuff outside of law enforcement, sadly, you've likely failed. Because you are more than just your career. You are more than just this profession. You've been called, created for more than anything that this career could do in the long term. It is a calling. It is an amazing calling. Thank God that you're doing it. But these things outside of law enforcement are so important, and it can't be understated. So that does it for this week's podcast. I pray that all of you in the path of this tropical storm Milton, soon to become Hurricane Milton, are protected, and that the devastation and potential damage that's going to cause doesn't happen. We can all pray maybe this thing just moves down below the Straits of Florida and weaves its way between Key West and Cuba and somewhere in that 90-mile stretch, and then just head out to the Atlantic. That's what we can all hope for. But if not, I pray that you guys are safe and that your homes are protected. I will certainly be back with you soon. I'll see you out there I'll see you next week here in the podcast and in the studio. And in the meantime, I'm going to see you on the Blue Line.